Hello, everybody. This is Deb McCullough. I'm happy to be here this afternoon. Looks like we've got a number of people from a whole bunch of different states, so I would like to thank you for participating today, and hopefully I can give you some useful information and maybe save you from some of the bad things that went on in the early days of emerald ash borer here in the north central region. Make sure everything's working. Yep, it seems to be. Before we get started, I have to recognize and make sure that everybody realizes I'll show you a lot of information that's been collected over more than a decade. A number of people have helped with this, including people like, get my arrow, there's Therese Poland and Nate Siegert. Nate used to be a grad student and a postdoc. He's with the Forest Service along with Therese now. Rodrigo Mercader is a professor down at Washburn now. Sarah Tanis is currently teaching at Kalamazoo College. And I also want to point out that most of the funding for the projects that have generated the information we'll present today have come from grants and cooperative agreements through the Forest Service and to some degree ARS. And I point that out particularly because myself and Therese, who have done a lot of this work, we've never taken funding from any of the pesticide companies for any of the work on emerald ash borer. So they take a risk when they work with us. They usually donate the product, but if it works well, we can say that. If it doesn't work at all, we will say that as well. We try to be really objective with the information we present. So with that caveat, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this map. It doesn't shrink. It gets larger every single year, and if you haven't been paying attention lately, Louisiana has become the most recent state to be infested here. There's a new infestation that was identified in February just across the border from Arkansas. So we're now up to 25 states as well as several infestations in Ontario and Quebec. And if you're not in a state that's infested yet, chances are good that you will be eventually. I think the nursery trees and ash logs are pretty well regulated now. Firewood is really difficult to regulate, as most of you are familiar with, and nobody can promise that there isn't infested firewood being still moved around the country, despite everybody's best efforts. Nobody knows how many dead ash trees there are now. We used to talk about tens of millions of dead ash trees. It's now in the hundreds of millions of dead ash trees, landscape ash trees, trees out in the forest, trees along streams and rivers, and so forth. And it just keeps progressing. And if you are in an area that becomes infested with emerald ash borer, you will be dealing with the problem on your own. The federal agencies, APHIS in particular, is continuing their detection surveys. Once an area is found to be infested, quarantines will be imposed that affect the ability of people to move ash trees, logs, and hopefully firewood around. But there is as yet no national EAB strategy, and one way or another you will end up, you being the greater royal you, somebody is going to end up dealing with all the ash trees, particularly in landscapes. This is information that we published a few years ago. That was a large group of us, some forest economists, some modeling people, some forest insect people, and we tried to identify the economic costs associated with the biggest, baddest forest insects in the country. And if you look at those numbers, this is the annual projected cost through 2020 of emerald ash borer as well as hemlock adelgid, gypsy moth. And you can see that most of the cost is with local governments. That will be municipalities who have to deal with ash on the streets and on municipal property, and then private households, private property, either spending money to treat or remove trees and having dying or declining trees affecting their property values. Timber too, ash borer is, the cost of ash borer and timber is outstripping the other pests by orders of magnitude. White ash timber, for example, is particularly valuable. That's what we make baseball bats out of, for one thing. And You know, some of the questions that come up pretty frequently are where and when should I be looking for EAB? Are there certain trees I can look at to see if they're going to be infested first? Are there any species that are more or less resistant to ash borer? And we've started looking at this in Michigan. There's 4 major ash species that occur here: green, white, black, and blue ash. I'll show you a little bit about some of this. If you think about what ash borers are doing, the host tree that the female beetles select is critical. Those mature females are making all the decisions about where the larvae are going to feed. And I'm sure most of you know the basic biology. The adults are active through most of the summer. They're going to nibble on ash leaves that whole span of time. But the beetles won't show any interest in mating until they've about a week after they've emerged, and the females won't start producing and laying eggs until close to 3 weeks after they've emerged. And so that's important for a number of reasons, but if you're an arborist or a landscaper trying to protect landscape ash, that's a really good window to target, because if you control the beetles before they lay eggs, you can save a lot of larval feeding. So once mama selects the tree and lays the eggs, then the larvae don't have any choice, and they're going to feed. Usually in southern Michigan, we'll see larvae beginning to feed by the middle of July. They'll feed all through the fall, and then most of them will pupate in the following spring and emerge as adults here. So one of the things we know is that stressed trees are going to be more attractive to ash borer adults than healthy trees, and I think this goes back to Asia and China, where these insects are native. They are secondary pests in their native range. They do not colonize healthy ash trees in China. They colonize very stressed trees. And if you girdle a tree and you take off the outer bark and the phloem, the inner bark, that seems to be just perfect for the beetles. The tree slowly, more or less, starves to death. The volatile chemicals that come off of the leaves and the wood and the bark, the profile, the compounds in those emissions change, and the beetles are very perceptive. And this graph here, what this is showing is the ratio of larvae on girdled trees compared to larvae on adjacent non-girdled trees. This is larvae per square meter. And when the densities are very low, when the infestation is 3-4 years old, you're going to see anywhere from 5 to 10, maybe 15 times more larvae on a girdled tree than you will on a healthy tree. And just to give you some perception of what that means, over here, around 25 or 30 larvae per square meter is where you will start to see symptoms of the canopy. The canopy will become thin, or you might just start to see some dieback up at the top. And then once you get out here, around 90 or 100 larvae per square meter, that is all that can develop on a given tree. They need about 10 square centimeters of phloem to feed and to develop. So out here is where the tree is going to be dead. The other thing we know is that beetles really, really like to be in the sun. So any kind of open-grown tree is going to be attractive to them. Trees on the edge are going to be more attractive than a tree in the middle of a wooded area, and so forth. We also know there's differences among ash species in terms of which ones are preferred by the beetles for hosts, and I won't show you all the stuff that we've done. We'll just cut right to the chase. The 2 most common ash species are green ash, Fraxinus pennsylvanica, and white ash, Fraxinus americana. The maps show their native range, but if you look, every state in the continental U.S. has green ash and white ash ornamental trees, landscape trees. So these are the ones that a lot of people are very interested in, and we can tell you that green ash is going to be colonized first and almost undoubtedly killed before white ash trees when they co-occur, and they do co-occur often. If you look at this graph here on the left, this was one of our very first studies. We had 3 different areas like this where the green and white ash trees were either intermixed, or green ash were on one side, white ash on the other. And this is the green ash here in the green bars, and the purple is the white ash. This is the number of adult exit holes per square meter. We started with 12 green ash and 12 white ash, and as the exit hole density increases, the green ash trees die. We're down to only 7 trees up here, and you can see by that density, if we can only get about 100 or 110 beetles per square meter, these trees were dead at the end of 2005. This data over here, this is a plantation we had. Every other tree was a green ash, white ash, green ash, white ash, and so forth. And you can see if you compare green ash to the white ash, they much heavier colonization of the green ash, and even if the trees are girdled, they still like the green ash much better. We see something similar when we go out into the forest. This is information that came from a study where we had, whoops, lost my arrow. We had 8 sites in southeast Michigan in the core of the ash borer invasion, 8 sites where the densities of ash borer were peaking. We call that the crest. And then 8 sites that had become recently infested, but you really couldn't see any sign of ash borer yet. We did a lot of surveys there, but the bottom line is that in the core, very, very few trees, almost none of the large trees are still alive. You can see even over a year, more mortality occurred. You can see that as the population builds up in the crest, we lose ash trees, and even in the cusp, we're starting to see the ash trees, the green ash, basically be functionally extirpated by and large. What's really concerning is that there are no seedlings germinating. We've lost the seed source in the core and even in the crest areas, so that doesn't bode well for the future of green ash. White ash is a little bit different. We looked at 40 different sites. We ended up picking 28 sites that had a lot of white ash. We're doing some surveys. This is an ongoing project, but in these 28 sites, we have anywhere from 100% mortality to almost 100% survival of white ash. And a lot of the sites, this is stems here, this is phloem here. You can see we have sites where much of the phloem remains alive. The trees have been attacked. We can see old galleries, but the trees are starting to heal. The density of ash borer is lower. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this. This is a brief summary. If the tree is out in the sun, the beetles are going to like it. If the tree is stressed, particularly if it's girdled, the beetles are going to like it. I don't think you have much black ash in the west, but if you do have black ash, very much preferred, and it's the most vulnerable species we've worked with. Green ash is going to be attacked before the white ash trees are. We don't know exactly what's going on with white ash. You could have anywhere from most of the trees surviving to every single white ash being killed. Blue ash we have in this part of the country, it's the most resistant. We're getting 60 to 70% survival of blue ash. And as far as native ash trees go, so far this one looks like the one that's going to survive. The important part of this is that you can watch these trees, the really vulnerable trees, to try to find ash borer early on. Anytime you have stressed ash, and especially if they're green ash or black ash trees, look at those, particularly if they're out in the open. Woodpecker attacks. You can see woodpecker holes here. They're quite a bit larger than the little tiny D-shaped exit holes the beetles leave. Woodpeckers are really good at finding infested ash trees. A lot of new infestations have been found because somebody noticed woodpecker holes up in the upper part of the canopy. That's what this graph is showing. The very first colonization usually takes place up in the canopy of a tree, and so if you're looking for ash borer, be sure you're checking up high on the main leader of the large branches. Another question always comes up, when do I have to start treating my ash trees? And that one it's a little bit fuzzier. We talk about the core, the crest, and the cusp. You don't want to treat trees too early because you're wasting money and wasting insecticide, but you also don't want to wait too long. And what makes it difficult is how hard it is to find newly infested trees and new infestations. None of these beetles in the family Buprestidae, and certainly not in the genus Agrylus, these beetles do not produce long-range pheromones. And the traps and lures that are used, the lures are based on volatiles that are emitted by the ash trees. That means that a trap is competing with all the ash trees in the area, and you have to hope that the beetles end up on the trap or you're going to miss them. And the other thing that makes it difficult is that once a county is found to be infested, or some unit of government, the regulatories stop. And so you can have one infestation going in part of a county, and much of the county will be uninfested, and it's very difficult to find that until you see symptomatic trees. The other thing that gets difficult is this dispersal. Most of the females, this graph is showing that most of the eggs laid by a generation of females are going to be within about 100 meters of the point where the females emerged. But then you get these females, the mature females that are overachievers. They fly further for whatever reason. We don't know how many do it. We don't know why. But you can't find those trees that are way out there that have just a few eggs and a few larvae laid on them. And that's what this graph is showing. This is something that we've modeled based on a lot of field data. This is showing that if you are, let's say, 1,000 meters from the origin of an infestation, a new one, that's about 1 kilometer. Somewhere out here, 5 years after that infestation has become established, you have almost a 0% probability of detecting it. You have to wait until the infestation builds up, the population gets higher, and you see some symptoms. And what happens is typically outliers, new infestations, are not found until they've been there for 4 to 6 years. And as the population builds up, you enter this really bad time period where you have most of the trees dying within about a 3 to 4 year span. And that's really unpleasant and really what you don't want to get into. These are photos that Dan Herms took. You can see in 06, these green ash trees, all of these trees were infested. You don't see any symptoms, but you look 3 years later and they're all dead, and now somebody's got to pay and deal with those trees. So you assume that all the landscape trees that are not being treated with insecticide are going to die. You either have to remove them or you have to treat them, and that's there's just really not a whole lot of other options. You have to think about the tree. You can't let it get too stressed. If the tree cannot carry these systemic insecticides up the trunk and into the canopy, they won't be affected. So once you see more than 50 or 60% of the canopy becoming thin or starting to die, it's probably too late. And I guess if there's one thing to take home from all of this today, it's that we are always behind ash borer. We're always lagging behind ash borer. And if you know that ash borer is within about 15 miles, you need to really be thinking seriously about protecting some of those trees. Now, in terms of what products to use, this list of insecticides, these are all systemic products that move up through the tree and up into the canopy. None of these were available in the early years of ash borer. All of them can be effective. I would say triage is still the most effective product out there. We've finished 2 studies. One of them went for 6 years, and we're getting 3 years of almost 100% control, even at the lowest rates of application. You just don't see that with any of the other products. Azadirachtin is a new one. It's a Canadian company producing triazine. Also applied as a trunk injection, a little bit different mode of action, but it can be effective, especially if you apply it annually. A couple of the other active ingredients, there's lots of imidacloprid products. There's Safari, which you can spray, you apply it as a basal bark spray. You can see what Treese is doing here, just spraying the lower 1.5 meters or so of the tree. It goes right through the bark and is carried up to the canopy of the tree. These can be effective. You have to put them on every year. And this is where you want to go to get a lot of information. This is a multi-state bulletin. We just updated last spring. Cliff Sadof is a co-author on here, Dan Herms, myself, and a couple other folks. So that's available on the Emerald Ash Borer website. Feel free, make as many copies as you would like. Real quickly here, the biological control, we can talk more about that if you have questions. Woodpeckers, you got to love woodpeckers. They're still the most important source of mortality. They feed on larvae typically in the winter time. But you can't count on the woodpeckers. So sometimes they eat a lot of the larvae, sometimes they skip the tree, and by the time they're feeding on the larvae have finished developing and they've already done their damage. There are native parasitoids that will get after ash borer. We're seeing them learn to go to ash trees. This is a parasitoid larva right here, and it's feeding on an emerald ash borer larva, which you see here. It takes them a while to learn about emerald ash borer, but we are seeing them more and more commonly and more abundantly. Unfortunately, it's typically when the trees are heavily infested and pretty much dying. But it may be important in the core areas as maybe some of the young ash starts to grow, and maybe the parasitoids will have a bigger effect there. This is the classical biocontrol program, the Asian parasitoids that the federal agencies are releasing. They've really ramped that up. It's going pretty well. They've released I believe more than 500,000 parasitoids in various states. The good thing is that the parasitoids and woodpeckers will be compatible with systemic insecticides. In other words, those systemic insecticides are not going to affect or harm either the predators or the parasitoids. The downside is that predators and parasitoids aren't having an effect on the growth of EAB populations or the rate of ash mortality so far. And again, it may be really important in the core areas. That's where we may see these natural enemies become most important. A lot of places are starting to talk now about IPM, and doing IPM, it begins with an inventory of urban trees, particularly your ash trees. What size, what's the species, are they healthy, do they warrant being protected, or should they be removed? If you're going to remove them, a lot of places now are girdling the trees in the spring, leaving them out there for a summer, then taking them down, and that way they serve as trap trees for that crop of larvae that year. We're also finding that if you mix girdle trees with triage trees, that can be very effective. The girdle trees attract the beetles to the area, and you increase the chance that they're going to encounter a toxic tree that way. You can treat the trees, and if you get the opportunity to release some of the Asian parasitoids, that's certainly a good idea. It's not going to hurt anything, and at some point that may become very important. So I think in terms of urban trees, we have lots of good options. The forest, it's a little bit more difficult. I'd say we have many fewer options there. We're still trying to figure out what to do. But I think that's all I have. So I will stop there and turn it over to Kathy.